Have you ever really thought about where religion comes from? I mean, not just one specific religion, but the whole idea of religion itself. Well, today we're digging into a really bold, super influential, and, let's be honest, deeply controversial theory from the 19th century that claimed to have the one single answer for all of it. Let's see if it actually holds up.
It really all boils down to this one pretty wild question. What if every single god, every deity, every divine being that humanity has ever looked up to started out as something way more familiar, something like the spirit of a dead person? That's the core idea we're going to explore today.
So who came up with such a radical idea? Well, for that, we have to go back to the 19th century and meet the man who put it all together, a thinker named Herbert Spencer.
Okay, so this is Herbert Spencer, a real intellectual heavyweight of the Victorian era. He cooked up what he called the ghost theory, and his argument was pretty stunning. He said, if you want to find the origin of religion, you don't need to look up at the stars or out at nature. Nope, you just need to look at one thing, the grave.
Spencer's theory actually has a formal name, manism, but that's just a fancy way of saying ghost worship. The idea is simple, but its implications are absolutely huge. It suggests that at the very, very root of every single faith is the act of worshiping the spirits of those who've died, especially our own ancestors.
And here's Spencer's starting point, right in his own words. He looked around the world at all these different cultures and societies, and he noticed something. Almost every single one of them has this belief that some part of us, call it a soul, a spirit, an other self, just keeps going after the body dies. For Spencer, this wasn't just some curious little fact. It was the seed, the absolute seed from which all religion would eventually grow.
Okay, so you've got this basic belief in a ghost, but how on earth do you get from that to a whole complex system of gods and goddesses? Well, Spencer thought he had it all mapped out. He saw it as a clear evolutionary path.
Spencer saw this as a totally logical progression. So it starts with that simple belief in a soul. Then, because these spirits are supernatural and kind of scary, they inspire fear and awe. So people start leaving them gifts, to appease them, keep them happy. That appeasement, or propitiation, becomes a regular ritual, and boom, you've got ancestor worship. Over time, people realize, hey, not all ancestors are created equal. They start to focus on the really important ones, the founder of the tribe, a legendary warrior, a great chief. And then finally, after generations and generations of worship, the memory of these incredible ancestors gets so grand and mythologized that they're not just great ancestors anymore. They've become gods.
And all of that leads to Spencer's ultimate grand conclusion. He argued that it didn't matter if a religion worshipped animals or plants or idols. If you trace it back far enough, you're going to find a revered ancestor at the bottom of it all. So in his view, a god is basically just a ghost that really leveled up. It's a powerful, tidy theory. But does the evidence actually support it?
All right, let's put this theory to the test. If Spencer is actually right, then we should expect to find that the oldest, most primitive cultures have the purest, strongest form of ancestor worship. And then it should get more complex from there.
Now, the source material we're working from for this explainer does exactly that. The author, W. Schmidt, digs into the ethnographic data from all sorts of cultures to see if Spencer's proposed pattern actually holds up in the real world.
And, well, this is where things get really complicated for Spencer's theory, because the findings are pretty much the exact opposite of what he predicted. In the oldest cultures, the ones they call primitive, the main thing they worship is often a single supreme being, and ancestor worship is actually super weak, barely there at all. It's only in the later, more developed cultures that you find these really strong, elaborate ancestor cults. The timeline seems completely backward.
So, this brings us to the final part, the critique of the ghost theory. Because the evidence we just saw doesn't just, fail to support Spencer's idea. The author argues it flat out contradicts it.
So yeah, the ethnographic data shows a clear pattern, all right? But it's the reverse of what Spencer said would happen. Instead of religion starting with a bunch of ghosts and evolving into high gods, the actual evidence from these cultures seems to suggest that a belief in a high god came first, and all that elaborate ancestor worship developed much, much later.
This quote really hits the nail on the head. It points out the single biggest problem for the ghost theory. If the oldest human cultures we can find already have a clear concept of a single supreme being, then that belief can't possibly have evolved from worshiping ghosts, because in those same cultures, the whole ghost worship thing hadn't even gotten off the ground yet.
So let's just quickly break down the 4 key flaws here. First, as we've seen, the timeline is all wrong. Second, the explanation for sacrifice is backward. The earliest offerings we see, like giving the first fruits of a harvest, are made to a supreme being, not to ghosts on a grave. Third, the theory just doesn't explain idol worship very well, which pops up in all sorts of contexts not connected to dead ancestors. And finally, and this is a big one, it never really explains how some deified first father of a tribe could somehow become more important than, and even block out, a pre-existing idea of a universal creator god. The smaller figure somehow replaces the bigger one, and it just doesn't add up.
And that leaves us right back here with this absolutely crucial question. Herbert Spencer's ghost theory was a neat, tidy, all-in-one origin story for religion. But if the evidence shows it's fundamentally flawed, if gods don't come from ghosts, then where in the world do they come from? And that's a question that continues to challenge absolutely everyone, from anthropologists to historians to theologians, even to this day.